I was asked to talk about how Marx's critique of capitalism might be strengthened by bringing in some ideas from Hegel's social philosophy. So that's what I've decided to talk about. And I'm going to focus on just one idea that I think unites both Hegel and Marx to some extent, to a large extent, and that's the idea of spirit, an idea that's not frequently associated with Marx, but is actually very important, I think, to Marx's criticism of capitalism. And it's an important idea that we should, I think, retain in some form. So in this talk, I'll explore how Marx's critique of capitalism might be reanimated by thinking about how the normative foundations of his critique are appropriations of standards Hegel employs in his account of rational social life, or Sittlichkeit. While I want to emphasize the continuities between these two standpoints, I'll also note some respects in which Marx's appropriation of Hegel underemphasizes important aspects of Hegel's account of what makes social life rational or good. In concluding, I'll suggest that Marxian theory could benefit from further incorporating certain of Hegel's normative insights. There are various respects in which Hegel and Marx share normative commitments, but the one I'll focus on today concerns what I'll call the aspirations of spiritual life. Viewed from this perspective, much of Marx's critique can be formulated as the claim that capitalism necessarily prevents us from living satisfyingly spiritual lives. It might seem strange to make spirit central to Marx's normative perspective, since, as we all know, Hegel was an idealist and Marx a materialist, and so it would seem their positions on spirit must be direct opposites. But the relation between their reviews is more interesting than one of simple opposition. There's more materialism in Hegel's idealism and more idealism in Marx's materialism than is standardly thought. That Hegel's conception of spirit, Geist, has materialistic features can be seen in his definition of spirit as sublated life. Aufgehobenes Leben is how Hegel understands spirit. Life, for Hegel, remains a constitutive moment of spirit, and any way of being in the world that negates life without preserving it is spiritless and dead. One way of formulating Hegel's position is to say that spirituality consists in ways in which free subjects relate self-consciously to life, including to their own nature as living beings. Spirit is at work for Hegel whenever humans engage in reconciling their natural neediness with their supreme aspiration, freedom. This implies that the form of social life appropriate to our spiritual nature is one in which our life activities are also sites of freedom, and where every expression of freedom is at the same time a material practice, addressed to our needs as living beings. When Hegel's conception of spirit is articulated in this way, it's not difficult to find it in Marx too. It's present, for example, in his claim on the Jewish question that human emancipation will be complete, I'm quoting now, only when the real human being in his empirical life, in his individual labor, in his individual relations, has known and organized his own forces as social forces, where knowing and organizing your own forces as social is essential to what Marx is thinking of as freedom or self-determined agency. Marx's critique of alienation is no less indebted to this Hegelian ideal, insofar as unalienated labor both satisfies our material needs and fulfills our aspiration to be self-determined. And the same ideal informs capital. Consider the passage where Marx characterizes free activity as follows. Freedom can consist only in socialized humans, associated producers, rationally regulating their material exchange with nature, bringing it under their collective control, instead of being dominated by it as by a blind power. What underlies all these claims is a vision of free activity, knowing and organizing your own forces, that incorporates two further points, namely that the free activity characteristic of humans is material, responsive to needs that we have as living beings, and intrinsically social or cooperative. In other words, two features of the human condition, our material neediness and our dependence on the collaboration of others, means that freedom will require collectively knowing and organizing our own forces as the social activities they in some sense always are. Okay, now Hegel. That a good social order enables us to give expression to our membership in both the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity, and in the very same activities, is precisely what Hegel takes himself to show in the philosophy of right, in demonstrating that the nuclear family, civil society, and the constitutional state are rational institutions. It's clear enough how the family and civil society serve material reproduction. The maintenance of individuals is facilitated by economic cooperation in producing the goods needed to sustain life, and the reproduction of the species is served by sexual cooperation in the family, for Hegel. For spiritual beings, however, there's always more at stake in raising children and producing goods than merely reproducing life. As spiritual activities, they at the same time promote or realize freedom, broadly conceived, and in doing so, they unite the ends of life with freedom. One thing this means is that these forms of social participation serve vital functions, but are also carried out with a consciousness of the ends they serve, and in this respect, they differ from the life-maintaining behaviors of merely living animal beings. Spiritual activities not only have a point, they also have a point for the very beings who engage in them. Moreover, because these agents are spiritual beings, the point of their activities can't be reduced to the mere reproduction of life. As spiritual activities, they're also ways in which social members realize and take themselves to realize freedom. Hegel's account of how freedom is realized in social activity is too complex to articulate fully here, but 2 points are important. First, when individuals see the point of participating in the family and civil society and embrace those institutions as good, their activities are deep and satisfying expressions of self-determined agency. For they're ways in which individuals live in accordance with their own understanding of what's good and important in human life. Under these conditions, individuals affirm the social world and their activities within it. That world is a home for them, and they're its makers, insofar as they continually recreate their social home through their own activity. The second aspect of free social activity derives from the consideration that since such activity is essentially cooperative, the conceptions of the good realized in social life must be shared with others. Raising a family and laboring to satisfy material needs aren't projects in which I realize my own idiosyncratic conception of the good, but ways in which we realize together a shared understanding of what makes our lives meaningful. Because in this domain I can act freely only by incorporating myself into a larger community with shared values and norms, there's an intersubjective element in the freedom realized in social life. In fulfilling the various roles that social members occupy in rational institutions, each affirms the contributions of his fellow members and recognizes them as beings of value, united in a common project of realizing the good. The spiritual nature of social life is also a prominent theme in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, as illustrated by the most primitive model of human society he considers there, the relationship between bondsman and lord, or master and slave. It's easy to see that the activities of bondsman and lord serve vital ends. The lord commands, the bondsman labors, and together these complementary activities produce the goods necessary for sustaining life. But the same activities have a significance in relation to freedom. The lord's commanding and the bondsman's obedience are grounded in and express a shared conception of freedom, of the superior value it has in relation to mere life, and of who among them possesses normative authority, the right to command, based on having proved himself to be above mere life in the struggle unto death. The asymmetry between bondsman and lord follows from the fact that the former gives in at the decisive moment of the struggle and chooses his life over freedom. But his doing so doesn't signal an abandonment of the basic normative position held before the struggle. That the bondsman continues to subscribe to the higher value of freedom is revealed by the fact that for both him and the Lord, prestige and authority, in short, recognition, attached to the individual who has expressed in his deeds the superior value of freedom in relation to mere life. The interaction between bondsman and Lord is spiritual then, because it imbues jointly undertaken activities of life with significance in relation to freedom. Moreover, it's social. They constitute an I that is a we, in the sense that neither individual can be what she is or do what she does without being integrated into the collective life of a we. One illustration of this I-we structure is that neither of the life-related activities of bondsman and lord is complete without the corresponding activity of the other, and neither makes sense on its own without being brought into relation with the larger end of social reproduction. But the I-we structure of social life also has a spiritual dimension. In good societies, I's aren't simply absorbed into the we without remainder. Rather, they retain a degree of independence from the we they compose, and each individual aspires to be and to be recognized as free and valuable in her own right. This shared aspiration implies that each I requires the recognition of others in order to find spiritual satisfaction. At the same time, a spiritual we is present, a normatively oriented recognitive community, because those I's are united by a conception of what's of ultimate value, where this shared commitment determines the relations of authority, including the hierarchy of recognition among social members. Finally, Hegel's understanding of the spiritual aspects of the bondsman-lord relation is materialistic in a way that Marx would endorse. The shared values, the relations of recognition, the norms of freedom that make this communal life spiritual don't exist merely in the minds of social members. Instead, they're real only insofar as they're expressed in material activity, for example, in the bondsman's labor. Labor here isn't merely a means for reproducing life. It's also an activity in which the values, freedom, and recognitive relations of its members are expressed. Although a society made up of bondsmen and lords represents an unsatisfying way in which humans attempt to unify their immersion in life with their understanding that they're free, all human societies, for Hegel, are engaged in some version of this project. One point of Hegel's analysis of bondsman and lord is that there are better and worse, more and less spiritually satisfying ways of arranging social relations. The bondsman-lord relation is ultimately unsatisfying for both its participants, and the important question is why. The problematic character of this relation could be located in any number of its features. Neither party finds recognition that's truly satisfying. Their relation is in fact one of domination rather than freedom. And the bondsman, in both his self-understanding and his way of life, is alienated from his true essence as free. None of these claims is wrong, but a more comprehensive description of the deficiency here is that the social order in question fails to unite freedom and the ends of life in a satisfying way. As I've suggested, this is because the various ways in which social members participate in life aren't at the same time expressions of their freedom, and because the activities they regard as expressions of freedom aren't at the same time ways of participating in life. One indication of this failure can be seen in the fact that the bondsman's labor is unfree in the straightforward sense that someone other than himself, the Lord, directs his activity and in a way that serves the Lord's ends rather than those of the laborer. A second failure is that rather than uniting freedom in life, a society of bondsmen and lords responds to its spiritual task with a strategy of splitting. Life gets split into two, insofar as production and consumption fall to different social classes. This has the result that consumption takes place in ignorance of the activity and of the agents that make it possible, while production is carried out not in order to satisfy spiritual aims, but only because obeying the Lord is a requirement of staying alive. The division within the activities of life implies spiritual division as well. Society divides into two groups, one of which is absorbed in life but unfree, while the other, as far removed as life from possible, enjoys, precisely for that reason, a kind of freedom. The problem isn't only that some are free while others aren't, but also that both freedom and life remain empty and unsatisfying. Labor for the necessities of life becomes a site of domination and self-denial rather than freedom, and its counterpart, enjoyment, devolves into luxury consumption that fails to satisfy. Those who labor do so merely in order to survive, while those who consume have a spiritual end in view, expressing their freedom, but are moved by a distorted vision of what that freedom consists in, namely complete independence from the ties of life. When Hegel's analysis of bondsman and lord is understood in this way, it's easy to see where many of the resources for Marx's critique of alienated labor come from. Marx expresses precisely Hegel's idea in describing alienated labor as a condition in which the worker no longer feels himself to be freely active in any but his animal functions, and in his human functions no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. But there's a feature of Hegel's view, a strand of idealism, you might say, that's generally taken to distinguish his account of the bondsman-lord relation from Marx's understanding of alienation. According to this interpretation, Hegel holds that the spiritual failings of bondsman and lord can ultimately be traced back to inadequate self-conceptions. More precisely, to conceptions of how free beings ought to relate to life that disavow our connectedness to life or misconstrue the threat it poses to being free. What unites bondsman and lord is an overly exalted conception of our nature and of the freedom we should aspire to. Both take freedom to consist in what eventually shows itself to be a deficient relation to life, in which humans assert their freedom by acting as though they had no essential relation to life, thereby demonstrating their superior status in relation to the merely living. That bondsman and lord subscribe to the same stark conception of freedom explains why the result of the struggle unto death is so asymmetric. If freedom requires absolute independence from everything other, then avowing one's ties to life, as the future bondsman does, is incompatible with being free. The unequal relation between bondsman and lord is an expression of this shared all-or-nothing view of freedom, coupled with the fact that in facing the prospect of death, one subject affirms the value of his life, while the other persists in valuing absolute independence. Thus, the one-sided recognitive relation between bondsman and lord is grounded in a certain conception of freedom and in the different relations to life that, in the struggle unto death, each has taken up in the world. Since patterns of recognition manifest themselves in material practices, bondsman and lord take up relations to life in society that are just as one-sided as the relations of recognition they express. In the economic sphere, the two moments of the reproduction of life, production and consumption, are torn apart, each falling to only one of the relations' poles. The bondsman labors while the lord enjoys, and in doing so, each at the same time relates to the other in the mode of recognition. For the bondsman, labor is at once a relating to life, a relating to self, that is an expression of his own attitude to freedom and life, and a relating to another subject through relations of recognition that define conditions of authority and subjection. This is to say that servile labor is spiritual activity, since it's a way, however unsatisfying, of negotiating the relation between freedom and life. If the spiritual deficiencies of the bondsman-lord relation can be traced back to impoverished conceptions of freedom, it seems to follow that social critique should focus on transforming the consciousness of social members, and that progress in history depends on progress in self-consciousness. Hegel often describes his position in ways that encourage this interpretation, but I won't consider here whether this is the best way to construe his view. What is clear is that Marx would reject any account of alienation that ascribed causal primacy to the ideas we hold about ourselves. I'll suggest below that this sometimes leads Marx to underestimate the role of enlightenment in social transformation. So let me summarize what I've said about Hegel's conception of spiritual activity. The hallmark of spirit is unifying freedom with life, such that every life activity is a site of freedom and every expression of freedom a material practice. In order for activities to be sites of freedom, they have to fulfill 4 conditions. First, we must be, this is the ideal I take to be in both Hegel and Marx. First, we must be aware of the point of what we do and regard it and the world that we produce through that activity as something good. Second, we, and not some alien will, must direct and organize our activity. Third, since human material activities are cooperative, we must incorporate ourselves into a community defined by some shared understanding of what's important, and where the activity of each makes sense only in the context of what we do together. Finally, we must find our activities sources of self-affirmation, which includes being recognized by others as valued social members. Now, I'm going to skip, I had an hour-long talk, which I have to turn into a 30-minute talk, so I have to leave out this long part where I analyze some passages in Marx that I think bring out similar ideas of spirit. So I'm going to skip all of that and then jump more or less to what I think Marx needs to learn. That's the wrong way of putting it. What I think we today who want to take Marx seriously need to also take seriously from Hegel, something like that. Okay, so the basic thrust of Marx's critique, and the things I've discussed but left out, but they're familiar to you, it doesn't matter. The basic thrust of his critique is that in capitalism, activity aimed at satisfying the ends of life, labor, is necessarily unfree. Or formulated slightly differently, that in capitalism, the labor that's in fact an activity of human subjects, and therefore ought to be an expression of freedom, takes the form instead of behavior appropriate to mere things, devoid of free agency. In making this point, Marx appeals to the same conception of self-determination found in Hegel's account of spiritual activity. That is, he portrays labor in capitalism as unfree, and therefore insufficiently spiritual, because it's not fully self-conscious or transparent. It's not self-directed. It's cooperative, but its products don't serve the collective good of those whose activity it is, and it's the source not of self-affirmation, but of degradation and domination. After claiming that there's a continuity in the normative standards employed by Hegel and Marx due to their similar conceptions of spirit, I now want to consider briefly how Marxian social thought might benefit from appropriating even more of Hegel's legacy than it standardly does. There are 3 interrelated elements of Hegel's account of rational social life, to which, in my view, Marx pays, at least sometimes, too little attention. Here, too, I'm going to reduce because I don't have time to go into all 3 points. So the first point was just a point about the role of institutions in creating the conditions under which the ends of life can be unified with the ends of freedom. Hegel would applaud Marx's commitment to the transparency and self-directedness of our material activity, but he'd also counter that it's only in institutions of the right kind that our particular life activities can be reliably infused with universality in the ways Marx thinks desirable. The second Hegelian point Marxian theory should take more seriously concerns the role that recognition achieved in social activity. I'm going to skip this because we heard enough about recognition last night, and the point I've got here is basically the same as Axel's. So let me just move on to the third. The claim I want to emphasize now is that Marx fails to do justice to Hegel's insight that human societies are normative orders, just as much as they're systems of cooperation for satisfying material needs, and that the norms that define these orders aren't merely epiphenomenal. Marx recognizes, of course, that social consciousness, including shared conceptions of justice and the good, plays a causal role in holding societies together and reproducing them. Like Hegel, he locates our material activities in the domain of the spiritual, regarding them as normatively informed by values such as freedom, equality, and the collective good, that are taken to legitimize the social system within which the activities take place. The problem is that, as a historical materialist, Marx also seems committed to denying not merely that the norms of capitalist society are anything more than tools of class domination, but also that any norms could be. At the very least, Marx's position on the normative underpinnings of his critique of capitalism is severely underdeveloped. His tendency to regard social consciousness as merely ideological stands in tension with the Hegelian idea that genuine ethical reflection, not merely sociological explanation of prevailing norms, is important to emancipatory politics. Marx is right to resist the idea, often ascribed to Hegel, that self-conceptions and the values implicit in them have causal primacy in determining the shape of history. But resisting this idea doesn't imply that emancipatory movements can do without genuine ethical reflection aimed at improving on prevailing norms, transforming them into more adequate conceptions of freedom and the good, rather than treating them only as mystified forms of consciousness that serve particular class interests. Bourgeois conceptions of equality and freedom do, in the context of capitalism, promote one-sided class interests, but as Marx himself sometimes admits, they're more than that too. Incorporating a Hegelian model of ethical reflection into Marxian theory would involve more than merely thinking about how a set of given norms serves certain particular class interests. It would also take those norms seriously as ethical claims, regarding them as attempts to articulate the good that, however flawed in their specific embodiments, are also the only normative resources we have for thinking about what a better social world might look like. In this case, discovering the limitations of prevailing norms, including their tendency when realized within certain social configurations to benefit one class at another's expense, implies not their wholesale rejection, but a modification of them in which old values aren't merely discarded but also preserved in a more encompassing ethical view. I want to suggest that the form of argumentation Hegel employs in the Phenomenology of Spirit offers Marx a model for normative critique that should be congenial to him. This is a negativistic critique that approaches its object without a fully determinate picture of the good social order, and achieves further determinacy by considering real-world instances of what it can recognize as normative failure, even in the absence of a fully determinate normative picture. Of course, the theory's ability to recognize a normative failure requires that it already be committed to some normative ideal that, though not completely empty, is also not finally worked out. In Hegel's case, and as I'm arguing in Marx's case too, this ideal is the interpenetration of freedom and material activity. The crucial methodological point is this: it's possible to recognize a given mode of production as one in which labor is systematically alienated, and hence unfree, without knowing exactly what unalienated labor would look like, or precisely which institutions would best promote it. What is essential to critique, and here too Hegel and Marx agree, is to understand why the normative failures it discovers in reality are more than merely accidental features of the institutions under investigation. When critique establishes this, it points beyond existing reality and provides not a recipe for fixing the problem, but some guidance for practice that aims at doing that. There's an important element of this model of critique that Marx fails to appropriate adequately. In the phenomenology, critique motivates not only a transformation of its object, but also a revision of the normative standards it employs. What gets transformed in this model of critique isn't only worldly reality, but also our understanding of what freedom is and of what's required in order for it to be realized. It would be unfair to claim that this moment of normative philosophizing is completely lacking in Marx. On the Jewish question, for example, can be read as a reflection on the nature of true freedom that's instigated by an apprehension of how the real social world, in aiming to realize a kind of freedom, produces instead conditions that, with the help of the general idea of spiritual freedom, can be recognized as normatively deficient. As his career progresses, especially as he develops historical materialism, Marx seems to become increasingly suspicious of this type of ethical reflection. focusing his critical energies instead on existing reality. This attitude tends to rob Marx of some of the ethical resources Hegel has at his disposal that enable him to retain limited ideals of the past, instead of discarding them tout court. Rather than simply rejecting, for example, the bourgeois freedoms embodied in schemes of individual rights, Hegel recognizes them as a part of human freedom, and in contrast to Marx on the Jewish question, strives to find a place for them within a more complex conception of freedom that's been revised precisely so as to acknowledge the real but limited value of individuals being free to act as they please, unconstrained by others. Ethical reflection that both negates and preserves